Harlem, New York. The Cotton Club blazed with light and music on Monday night, September 16, 1935. Over 200 patrons filled the legendary nightclub, wealthy white socialites rubbing shoulders with gangsters and politicians, illegal whiskey flowing like water, the band playing loud enough to shake the chandeliers. Nobody paid attention to the quiet black man sitting alone near the back, nursing bourbon with the patience of a predator. Nobody noticed until Dutch Schultz, the most powerful bootlegger in New York, stood up from his table and began stomping toward him with murder in his eyes. What happened next would leave 9 men dead in 7 days, and the criminal underworld would never forget the lesson written in blood. The Cotton Club occupied a peculiar position in 1935 New York, a whites-only establishment planted directly in the heart of Black Harlem, where wealthy downtown crowds came to watch black performers while black residents were barred from entering as patrons. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all on the gangsters who controlled the club and the illegal gambling operations that surrounded it. On this particular Monday night, the club was operating at full capacity, the stage show featuring some of Harlem's finest musicians, the conversation loud, the atmosphere electric with the particular energy that came from mixing money, power, and illegality in a single room. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known throughout Harlem as Bumpy, occupied a table near the rear of the establishment. His presence in the whites-only club was tolerated because of who he was and what he represented. Johnson controlled a significant portion of Harlem's policy banking operations, the illegal numbers game that generated substantial revenue and employed hundreds of local residents. He was not the most powerful gangster in New York, not by any measure, but within the boundaries of Harlem itself, his word carried weight, and his reputation for calculated violence kept competitors and enemies alike at a respectful distance. Johnson sat alone that night, watching the stage show with the quiet intensity that characterized his every public appearance. He dressed impeccably, his suit tailored, his shoes polished, his demeanor suggesting a man entirely comfortable with himself and his position in the world. He sipped his bourbon slowly, seemingly absorbed in the music, apparently unaware of or unconcerned by the hostile glances being directed at him from across the room. Dutch Schultz had been watching Johnson for most of the evening. Schultz, born Arthur Flegenheimer, had built one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in New York history. His bootlegging operations generated an estimated $20 million annually. His political connections reached into the highest levels of city government. His reputation for violence was legendary, built on a willingness to kill anyone who stood between him and profit. For the past 18 months, Schultz had been systematically taking over Harlem's policy banking operations, using a combination of bribes, threats, and outright murder to drive out the black operators who had built those businesses. Schultz had already forced Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary numbers queen, into retirement. He had driven Casper Hallstein, the man who had pioneered policy banking in Harlem, completely out of business. One by one, the black gangsters who had controlled Harlem's underworld had been pushed aside, bought out, or eliminated. Only Bumpy Johnson remained as a significant obstacle to Schultz's complete control of the neighborhood, and Schultz had grown tired of waiting for Johnson to fall in line like the others. The expensive whiskey had been flowing freely all evening, and by 11 o'clock, Schultz's face was flushed red, his movements becoming increasingly agitated, his voice growing louder as he complained to his associates about the continued existence of this particular problem. The alcohol stripped away whatever restraint Schultz might normally have exercised, and finally he stood up from his table, knocking over glass in the process, and began walking toward where Johnson sat. The club's atmosphere shifted immediately. Conversations died mid-sentence as patrons turned to watch Schultz's progress across the room. His bodyguards scrambled to follow, their expressions suggesting they knew something unpleasant was about to happen. The band faltered, the music trailing off as even the performers sensed the change in energy. By the time Schultz reached Johnson's table, the Cotton Club had fallen completely silent, 200 people holding their breath, waiting to see what would unfold. Schultz did not lean down for a private conversation. He did not lower his voice or attempt to maintain any pretense of civilized discourse between criminal equals. Instead, he slammed his palm down on Johnson's table with enough force to send the bourbon glass jumping, spilling amber liquid across the white tablecloth, and he began shouting. His voice carried to every corner of the silent club, ensuring that every person present would hear every word of what he was about to say. The language Schultz used was shocking even by the standards of 1935, even in a segregated establishment where racial contempt was built into the very structure of the business. He called Johnson every racial slur in the American vocabulary. He questioned Johnson's intelligence, his manhood, his right to exist in the same world as white criminals. He accused Johnson of being too stupid to understand when a white man was offering him a chance to survive. He demanded that Johnson submit, work for him, accept his place in the racial hierarchy that Schultz believed governed not just legitimate society, but the criminal underworld as well. Johnson did not stand up. He did not reach for the weapon he carried. He did not make any threatening gesture whatsoever. He simply sat there, looking up at Schultz with eyes that revealed nothing, no anger, no fear, no reaction to the torrent of abuse being directed at him. He waited with perfect patience for Schultz to finish, his stillness more unsettling to the watching crowd than any display of rage could have been. When Schultz finally paused to catch his breath, Johnson spoke. His voice was so quiet that people at nearby tables had to strain to hear him, so calm that it seemed completely disconnected from the fury Schultz had been displaying, so cold that witnesses would later describe it as the most frightening sound they had ever heard, because it contained no heat, no emotion, nothing but the absolute certainty of a man stating simple facts. Johnson gave Schultz 7 days to remove every one of his people from Harlem. After that deadline, any white man found running policy operations in the neighborhood would die. Not be arrested, not be beaten, but killed. Johnson made clear that Schultz's choice to disrespect him publicly, to use those particular words in front of these particular witnesses, would carry consequences. Those consequences would be measured in bodies. Schultz laughed, a genuine, booming laugh that filled the silent club. He turned to address the crowd, playing to his audience, mocking the very idea that this black gangster could make demands of Dutch Schultz. He promised that in 7 days, Johnson would either be working for him or would be dead, because that was simply how the world worked. White men did not lose to colored men. That was the natural order of things. Johnson did not respond to the mockery. He simply finished what remained of his bourbon, stood slowly, and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for him instinctively, as if being near him had suddenly become dangerous. He walked past Schultz without looking at him, walked past the bodyguards who tensed but did not move to stop him, walked out of the Cotton Club into the September night, and disappeared into the darkness of Harlem streets. Schultz watched him go, still chuckling, still shaking his head at the absurdity of what had just occurred. He returned to his table, ordered another drink, and spent the rest of the evening telling everyone who would listen how he had put that uppity colored boy in his place. By the time Schultz went to bed that Monday night, he had convinced himself that the confrontation represented a complete victory, that Johnson had been publicly broken, that Harlem would be entirely under his control within weeks. Less than 7 hours later, the first body was discovered, and Dutch Schultz began learning that he had made the worst mistake of his criminal career. Understanding what happened over the following 7 days requires understanding what was going through Bumpy Johnson's mind as he walked through Harlem streets after leaving the Cotton Club. Johnson was not surprised by Schultz's behavior. He had been expecting something like this for months, had been watching Schultz's campaign to control Harlem with the careful attention of a man who knew his own survival depended on understanding his enemies better than they understood themselves. Johnson had observed Schultz's takeover strategy in detail. He had watched Schultz drive out operator after operator, had studied the methods employed, had analyzed both the successes and the failures. Most importantly, Johnson had identified the fundamental mistakes Schultz was making, strategic errors that revealed deep misunderstandings about how power actually functioned in Harlem, about what made the neighborhood's criminal operations work, about the difference between controlling territory through fear and maintaining long-term control through community support. Schultz's first critical mistake was assuming that violence alone would be sufficient to control Harlem. He had brought overwhelming advantages in money, firepower, and political connections. He had demonstrated absolute willingness to kill anyone who opposed him. But he had not brought understanding. He did not comprehend that Harlem's policy banking operations functioned because of community trust. The numbers game worked because ordinary people believed that despite the illegality involved, the operators were at least Harlem people who understood the neighborhood and had some stake in its well-being. Schultz's collectors were outsiders. White men who came into Harlem to extract money and who treated local residents with open contempt. They did not live in the neighborhood, did not know the people, did not care about anything except collecting cash and delivering it to their boss. This created resentment that Schultz either failed to notice or actively dismissed as irrelevant. The community that made policy banking profitable was increasingly hostile to the people now running the operations, and that hostility would prove decisive when the time came to choose sides. Schultz's second mistake was conducting his takeover through visible public violence that attracted attention and created enemies. When Schultz killed a black operator, that operator's family and friends and former employees became potential allies for anyone opposing Schultz. When Schultz's enforcers beat runners who failed to cooperate quickly enough, those runners spread stories throughout the neighborhood about white brutality, turning public opinion against the takeover even as the takeover succeeded in business terms. Schultz was winning the territory while losing the people who made the territory valuable. But Schultz's most catastrophic mistake was the confrontation at the Cotton Club itself. By screaming racial slurs at Johnson in front of 200 witnesses, by making the conflict explicitly about race rather than business, by publicly humiliating a black gangster in terms that resonated with centuries of oppression and degradation, Schultz had transformed what could have been a straightforward territorial dispute into something much larger and much more dangerous. Schultz had given Bumpy Johnson moral authority. After that night at the Cotton Club, opposing Schultz was no longer just about business competition or territorial control. It was about racial dignity, about whether white gangsters could openly degrade black gangsters without consequences, about whether the same hierarchies that govern legitimate society would be allowed to govern the criminal underworld as well. Johnson understood immediately that Schultz's racist tirade had handed him a weapon more powerful than any gun. As Johnson walked toward his apartment on West 139th Street, his mind was already working through the implications and formulating a response. The response he conceived had three essential elements, each carefully designed to achieve specific objectives while minimizing the risks involved. The first element was complete operational silence. Johnson would disappear from public view immediately. He would close his policy banks temporarily, stop conducting visible business, go to ground so thoroughly that Schultz's men would be unable to find him regardless of how hard they searched. This served two purposes simultaneously. It protected Johnson from the inevitable retaliation Schultz would attempt once the killings began, and it created the impression that Johnson had been frightened into hiding by Schultz's public threats, which would make Schultz overconfident and careless. The second element was the systematic elimination of Schultz's key Harlem operators. Johnson would not attack Schultz directly. That would be both practically difficult, since Schultz was too well protected, and strategically counterproductive, since killing a major white gangster would trigger massive retaliation from the entire white criminal establishment. Instead, Johnson would kill the 9 men who actually ran Schultz's Harlem operations day to day. The collectors who gathered money, the enforcers who intimidated people, the policy bank managers who processed bets. Remove those 9 men. Remove them brutally and publicly, and Schultz's entire Harlem operation would collapse without Johnson ever having to confront Schultz's full organizational strength. The third element was ensuring that this conflict would establish principles lasting far beyond the immediate situation. This could not be just about driving Schultz out of Harlem. This had to send a message to every white gangster in New York, a message that would govern future interactions between white and black criminals for generations to come. The message was simple: disrespecting black gangsters, using racist language, assuming that white superiority gave you license to treat colored criminals with contempt. All of that would carry severe and inevitable consequences. The message had to be written in blood, written clearly enough that no one who heard the story would ever forget it. Johnson reached his apartment at approximately 1:30 on Tuesday morning. He did not sleep. Instead, he summoned his most trusted associates, men who had worked with him for years, who had demonstrated loyalty and capability under pressure, who would follow orders without hesitation and keep secrets regardless of consequences. These men gathered in Johnson's apartment as the night deepened, and Johnson explained exactly what was about to happen. The plan was methodical, precise, and brutal. 9 of Schultz's key Harlem operators would die over the next 7 days. They would die in order, 1 per day for the first week, with additional deaths on certain days to complete the count. Each body would be discovered quickly, and each body would carry a note counting down how many remained. The notes would make clear why these men were dying and what Schultz needed to do to stop the killing. Johnson's men listened carefully, asked necessary questions about logistics and timing, and accepted their assignments without argument. They understood what was at stake. They had all witnessed or heard about what happened to the Cotton Club. They knew that Schultz had publicly humiliated their leader using language that degraded not just Johnson, but every black person in Harlem. The killings they were being asked to perform were not just business operations. They were acts of racial vengeance, payback for every insult and every slur and every assumption of white superiority that had governed their lives. By 5:30 on Tuesday morning, everything was arranged. Targets had been assigned to specific killers. Surveillance teams were in place to track movements and identify vulnerabilities. Weapons had been gathered, vehicles secured, safe houses prepared for the work that needed to be done away from witnesses. The machinery of systematic murder was ready to begin operating. At 6 o'clock, Bumpy Johnson walked out of his apartment carrying a small suitcase, climbed into a car driven by one of his associates, and vanished. For the next 7 days, nobody outside Johnson's inner circle would see him or know his location. He became a ghost, present only in the methodical executions of Schultz's men, invisible to the people desperately searching for him. Schultz would offer substantial rewards for information about Johnson's whereabouts. He would send men throughout Harlem asking questions, making threats, demanding cooperation. But Harlem remembered what Schultz had said at the Cotton Club, and Harlem would not help the white man who had called them those names find the black man who was killing his operators in response. The disappearance of Bumpy Johnson created a strange atmosphere throughout Harlem in the days following the Cotton Club confrontation. Word of what Schultz had said spread quickly through the neighborhood, carried by witnesses who had been present and by the employees who had heard everything. By Tuesday morning, virtually everyone in Harlem knew that Dutch Schultz had publicly called Bumpy Johnson racial slurs, had mocked him in front of hundreds of people, had declared that black gangsters could never defeat white gangsters because that was simply how the world worked. The reaction throughout the community was immediate and visceral. Schultz had not merely insulted Johnson personally. He had expressed contempt for the entire neighborhood, had made clear that he viewed black people as inherently inferior, had treated Harlem as territory to be conquered and exploited rather than a community to be respected. Whatever people thought about Johnson's criminal activities, whatever reservations they might have had about the violence that characterized underworld operations, Schultz had made himself the enemy of every black resident in Harlem through his words that night. This community sentiment would prove crucial to Johnson's strategy. Schultz's men began searching for Johnson on Tuesday morning, offering money for information, questioning anyone who might know something about his whereabouts. They visited Johnson's known associates, his former haunts, the locations where his policy banking operations had been conducted. They threatened people who claimed ignorance and promised rewards to anyone who could provide useful information. They found nothing. Harlem had closed ranks around Bumpy Johnson with a completeness that Schultz had never anticipated. People who might ordinarily have been willing to sell information to the highest bidder suddenly developed total ignorance about Johnson's activities. Runners who had worked for Johnson's operations vanished from their usual locations. Associates who might have been vulnerable to pressure disappeared into the neighborhood's vast network of apartments and rooming houses. The entire community participated in a silent conspiracy to protect the man who was about to start killing white gangsters. This protection was not organized or directed from any central authority. It emerged spontaneously from the collective outrage that Schultz's words had generated. Ordinary people who had no direct connection to the criminal underworld refused to cooperate with Schultz's searchers simply because they had heard what Schultz had called their people. Shopkeepers who saw suspicious activity chose not to report it. Landlords who rented to Johnson's associates declined to answer questions. The entire neighborhood became hostile territory for anyone working on Schultz's behalf. Meanwhile, the first phase of Johnson's plan was already in motion. Vincent Mell, one of Schultz's most effective policy collectors in central Harlem, had been under surveillance since Monday evening. Johnson's men knew his routes, his schedule, the times when he would be most vulnerable. They knew that Mell finished his collection rounds around 11 o'clock each night, that he typically accumulated several $1,000s in cash before making his delivery to Schultz's main policy bank. At approximately 11:15 on Monday night, while Schultz was still at the Cotton Club entertaining his associates with the story of how he had humiliated Johnson, 3 of Johnson's men intercepted Mell's car on a quiet side street in central Harlem. They forced him off the road at gunpoint, dragged him from his vehicle before he could reach his own weapon, and transported him to an abandoned warehouse on West 147th Street. The warehouse was one of several properties that Johnson's organization controlled, a location chosen specifically because its thick walls would contain any sounds that might otherwise attract attention. What happened in that warehouse over the following hours was designed not merely to end Mell's life, but to send a message through his corpse. The men who conducted the work were methodical and thorough. They ensured that Mell understood why this was happening to him, that he knew his death was a direct consequence of working for a man who had publicly disrespected black gangsters. They took their time, ensuring that when the body was eventually discovered, the extent of Mell's suffering would be unmistakable. The body was placed in a large metal garbage drum and transported to an alley on West 145th Street, a location where it would certainly be discovered during the morning sanitation rounds. Before leaving, Johnson's men pinned a note to Mell's shirt using a straight pin. The note was written in block letters with a simple pencil on ordinary paper, untraceable to any specific person or location. The message was brief and clear. 1 down, 8 to go. Leave Harlem. At 6:23 on Tuesday morning, sanitation worker James Robertson discovered the drum, opened it to determine why it was so heavy, and found Mell's brutalized corpse. His shouts for help brought police within minutes, and by 7 o'clock, detectives were examining the scene, reading the note, and understanding that they were looking at the beginning of a gang war rather than an isolated homicide. Word spread quickly through New York's criminal underworld. By 9 o'clock, virtually everyone connected to organized crime knew that Vincent Mell was dead, that he had been tortured extensively before being killed, that a note promised 8 more deaths were coming. Dutch Schultz received the news while eating breakfast at his Bronx headquarters. His initial reaction was dismissal. He assumed the killing was probably unrelated to the Cotton Club incident, perhaps a personal dispute or a robbery gone wrong. Then Schultz learned about the note, the countdown, the explicit promise that more bodies would follow. And Schultz understood that Bumpy Johnson had meant exactly what he said that Monday night. The 7-day ultimatum was not empty posturing or desperate bluffing. It was a literal promise, and Johnson had begun fulfilling it less than 12 hours after making it. Schultz's reaction was predictable. Rage, threats, demands that his men find Johnson immediately and kill him. But Johnson had vanished completely. His apartment was empty, apparently abandoned. His policy banks had ceased operations. His known associates had scattered throughout the city. Every lead Schultz's men pursued ended in frustration. Every source they contacted claimed complete ignorance. Every threat they made produced nothing useful. The manhunt would continue throughout the week, growing more desperate as the bodies accumulated. Schultz would offer increasingly substantial rewards for information about Johnson's location. He would threaten severe consequences for anyone caught helping Johnson hide. He would send dozens of men into Harlem to search, to question, to intimidate. None of it would matter. Johnson had become invisible, protected by a community that had decided collectively that the white gangster who had called them those names would receive no help finding the black gangster who was killing his men in response. The second body was discovered on Wednesday afternoon. Raymond Sullivan, known throughout Schultz's organization as Red because of his hair color, was found in an abandoned building on Lenox Avenue at approximately 2:15. He had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style, a clean and professional killing that contrasted sharply with the prolonged torture that had characterized Mel's death. Sullivan had not been alone when he died. 2 bodyguards, assigned to protect him after Mel's murder, were found nearby. Both had been shot multiple times in what appeared to be a brief gunfight they had lost decisively. The scene suggested that Johnson's men had ambushed the group, eliminated the bodyguards quickly and efficiently, then executed Sullivan at their leisure. The note pinned to Sullivan's body continued the countdown. 2 down, 7 to go. Wednesday morning had brought another envelope to Schultz's Bronx headquarters, slipped under the door sometime during the night. The message inside was written in the same block letters. 1 down, 8 to go. Your collector is dead because you disrespected us. The next one dies today. Pull out of Harlem or keep counting bodies. The envelope's delivery demonstrated something that terrified Schultz even more than the killings themselves. Johnson's men could reach his headquarters, could approach his door, could leave messages without being detected. If they could deliver envelopes, they could presumably deliver bombs. Schultz doubled his security, stationed armed men at every entrance to his building, ordered constant patrols of the surrounding area. It made no difference. Thursday morning brought another envelope, another message in block letters. 2 down, 7 to go. Every day you stay in Harlem, another one of your people dies. How many bodies will it take before you understand? Leave now. The third death came late Wednesday night, technically early Thursday morning. Thomas Brennan, known as Little Tommy despite being nearly 6 feet tall, was found in his own apartment, stabbed 17 times with an ice pick. The wounds were distributed across his body in a pattern suggesting methodical torture rather than frenzied violence. Brennan had clearly suffered for an extended period before being allowed to die. His neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual, which meant either that Johnson's men had gagged him effectively or that the neighbors had chosen not to hear anything that might involve them in dangerous business. The note with Brennan's body read, 3 down, 6 to go. Last chance to leave. By Thursday afternoon, Dutch Schultz was no longer dismissive or confident. The bravado he had displayed at the Cotton Club had evaporated entirely, replaced by something that witnesses described as genuine fear. 3 of his key Harlem operators were dead in 3 days, killed with a precision and capability that Schultz had not anticipated. The notes kept coming, kept counting down, kept reminding him that 6 more deaths were promised unless he withdrew completely from Harlem. Schultz called an emergency meeting with his top lieutenants on Thursday evening. He demanded that they find Johnson regardless of cost, that they kill everyone associated with Johnson, that they burn Harlem to the ground if necessary to stop these executions. His lieutenants listened and nodded and promised to intensify their efforts, but privately they understood that finding Johnson was essentially impossible. The entire community was protecting him. Every potential source of information had gone silent. Every approach they tried produced nothing but frustration. More troubling to Schultz's lieutenants was the growing terror among the remaining Harlem operators. These men understood that 6 of them were still on whatever list Johnson was working from. 6 more bodies were promised, and there was no indication that Johnson intended to stop. Several of Schultz's Harlem people had already approached lieutenants asking to be reassigned to operations outside the neighborhood. Others had simply failed to show up for their regular duties, presumably having decided that unemployment was preferable to execution. Thursday evening brought another envelope to Schultz's headquarters. 3 down, 6 to go. The next one dies tomorrow, then 5 more after that. Or you can pull out of Harlem today and nobody else has to die. Your choice. Schultz chose to keep fighting. He increased the bounty on information about Johnson's location. He assigned additional bodyguards to his remaining Harlem operators. He made clear to everyone in his organization that retreat was not an option, that giving in to Johnson's demands would make Schultz look weak and invite challenges from every ambitious criminal in New York. The Harlem operation would continue, and eventually Johnson would make a mistake that would allow Schultz to find and kill him. The fourth body was discovered Friday morning. Anthony Benedetto, known as Little Tony, was found beaten to death in an alley behind a grocery store on West 142nd Street. The killing appeared to have been fast and brutal, a departure from the prolonged torture that had characterized some of the earlier deaths. The note read, 4 down, 5 to go. Friday afternoon brought the fifth death, and this one demonstrated a new level of boldness that shocked even hardened observers of underworld violence. Joseph Catalano, known as Joey Numbers because of his skill with policy banking calculations, was shot in the face in a crowded restaurant on Lenox Avenue at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Dozens of witnesses watched 2 black men walk calmly into the establishment, approach Catalano's table, execute him with a single shot, and walk out before anyone could react. The killing took less than 10 seconds, and the killers disappeared into Harlem streets without any pursuit. The restaurant execution sent a clear message: nowhere was safe. Johnson's men could strike in broad daylight, in public places, with dozens of witnesses present, and still escape without consequence. The remaining Harlem operators were not merely at risk in dark alleys or isolated locations. They were vulnerable everywhere, at all times, regardless of what precautions they took. The note with Catalano's body read, 5 down, 4 to go. Leave now or die. Friday evening brought a longer message to Schultz's headquarters, an envelope containing not just the usual countdown, but an extended explanation of exactly why these killings were happening. The message was written in the same block letters but ran to several paragraphs, spelling out in explicit terms the connection between Schultz's words at the Cotton Club and the deaths of his operators. The message accused Schultz of disrespecting black people, of coming into their neighborhood with contempt and arrogance, of assuming that being white gave him license to say anything and do anything without consequences. It reminded Schultz that he had called black gangsters inferior, had used language that degraded an entire community, had treated Harlem as conquered territory rather than a neighborhood of people who deserved respect. The message concluded with a simple ultimatum: get out of Harlem, never come back, and never disrespect black brothers again. Saturday brought the 6th death. Michael Russo, one of Schultz's policy bank managers, was found shot in his car on West 138th Street shortly after dawn. He had apparently been killed sometime during the night while driving home from work. The car's windows were shattered by gunfire, and Russo had been hit multiple times in the head and chest. The note read, 6 down, 3 to go. By Saturday afternoon, Schultz's Harlem operation was in complete disarray. Several operators had fled the city entirely, deciding that distance from New York was the only reliable protection against Johnson's killers. Others had stopped working but remained in the area, hoping that their absence from active operations would remove them from whatever Liz Johnson was using. The few who continued working did so surrounded by bodyguards, moving constantly, never staying in any location long enough to become an easy target. The 7th death came Saturday evening. Harold Weinstein, known as Bunny, was one of Schultz's most senior lieutenants, the man who had been coordinating the Harlem takeover from the beginning. Unlike the previous victims, Weinstein was killed outside Harlem entirely. His body was found in his car on West 47th Street in Midtown Manhattan, shot in the back of the head in broad daylight in one of the busiest parts of the city. The Midtown killing demonstrated that Johnson's reach extended far beyond Harlem's boundaries. Schultz's people were not safe anywhere in the city. The protection of distance and location meant nothing when Johnson's men could track their movements and strike wherever they happened to be. The note with Weinstein's body drove the point home. 7 down, 2 to go. Your time is running out. Dutch Schultz spent Saturday night in a state approaching panic. He was barricaded in his Bronx headquarters, surrounded by armed men, refusing to leave for any reason. He sent frantic messages to his remaining Harlem operators, warning them to go into hiding, to protect themselves however they could, to survive Sunday, so that Johnson's threats would not be completely fulfilled. Schultz still refused to consider withdrawal, still believed that retreating from Harlem would destroy his reputation and invite challenges from rivals. But his confidence was clearly shaken, and his lieutenants noticed that he startled at every unexpected noise, jumped at every sudden movement. Sunday morning, Schultz received word that 2 of his remaining operators had disappeared overnight. Patrick O'Brien was hiding in a safe house in the Bronx, protected by 4 armed guards. Francis Murphy had fled to New Jersey, hoping that crossing state lines would provide some measure of safety. Neither man had any intention of returning to Harlem regardless of what Schultz ordered. They had seen what happened to their colleagues and had no desire to join a body count. Sunday passed with terrible slowness for everyone connected to Schultz's organization. Hours crept by without word of new killings, and Schultz began to allow himself hope that perhaps Johnson had made his point, that perhaps 8 deaths had satisfied whatever vengeance Johnson was pursuing. The hope proved to be premature. At 47 minutes past 8 on Sunday evening, a woman knocked on the door of the Bronx safe house where Patrick O'Brien was hiding. She claimed to have the wrong apartment, appeared confused and apologetic, seemed completely harmless. When one of the guards opened the door to redirect her, she threw a gasoline bomb into the apartment. The safe house erupted in flames immediately. The guards ran for the back exit and were cut down by shotgun fire from men waiting in the alley behind the building. O'Brien attempted to escape through a window and was shot before he could climb through. His body fell back into the burning apartment, where it would be badly charred before firefighters arrived to extinguish the blaze. Francis Murphy died 2 hours later in New Jersey. He had believed that leaving New York would protect him, but Johnson's men had tracked his movements across state lines. Murphy was shot multiple times in the parking lot of the motel where he had been hiding, killed within sight of the New Jersey Turnpike by men who drove away calmly into the night. The notes recovered from both scenes completed the countdown. 8 down, 1 to go. 9 down, 0 to go. Harlem belongs to Harlem. Don't ever disrespect black brothers. Leave and never come back. Monday morning, September 23rd, 1935, Dutch Schultz received a final message from Bumpy Johnson. The envelope arrived at his Bronx headquarters like all the others, slipped under the door during the night by messengers who were never seen or identified. The message inside was longer than the previous notes, a comprehensive statement of what had happened and why. 9 of you men are dead. They died because you made a choice to disrespect me in public, to call me names in front of hundreds of people, to treat colored gangsters as inferior to white criminals. You thought I was bluffing when I said your people would start dying. You laughed at me. You called me stupid. You said I did not understand how the criminal world really works. I was not bluffing. Your 9 dead men prove that. You have 24 hours to close every operation you have in Harlem. After that, I start killing your people everywhere, not just in Harlem, but in the Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan. 1 per day until you are completely gone from our neighborhood. This is not about money or territory anymore. This is about respect. This is about teaching you and every other white gangster in New York that you cannot disrespect black brothers without paying a price. That price is 9 bodies so far. It will be more if you do not leave. Get out. Stay out. And remember what it cost you when you forgot that colored gangsters deserve the same respect you demand for yourself. By Tuesday evening, every one of Dutch Schultz's Harlem operations had been shut down. He pulled his people out completely, abandoned 18 months of work and substantial financial investment, retreated from the neighborhood rather than continue losing men to an opponent who had demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to keep killing indefinitely. Schultz's policy banks closed. His collectors stopped their rounds. His enforcers withdrew to other territories. Harlem belonged to Harlem once again. The story spread throughout New York's criminal underworld with remarkable speed. Within days, every speakeasy and policy bank and mob social club in the city knew what had happened. Dutch Schultz, one of the most powerful gangsters in New York, had publicly humiliated Bumpy Johnson using racist language of the Cotton Club. Within 7 days, 9 of Schultz's men were dead, and Schultz had been driven out of Harlem entirely by a black gangster who had proven that disrespect carried fatal consequences. Bumpy Johnson emerged from hiding on Tuesday, September 24th. He walked down Lenox Avenue in the afternoon sunlight, dressed impeccably as always, acknowledging greetings from residents who had not seen him in a week. When reporters approached asking about the 9 murders, Johnson's response was simple and carefully phrased. He claimed no knowledge of the killings, but offered an observation about how Harlem protected its own. Anyone who came into the neighborhood disrespecting its people, calling them names, treating them as inferior, would learn that choices carry consequences. Johnson's statement concluded with words that would be repeated throughout the underworld for decades. Dutch Schultz made his choice Monday night at the Cotton Club. He chose to disrespect me in public, and he paid for that choice with 9 of his people. That is simply how it works. You disrespect black brothers, you pay the price. Remember that, and you will live a lot longer. Dutch Schultz never returned to Harlem. His reputation had been severely damaged by the retreat, and rivals throughout the city took note of his vulnerability. 1 month later, on October 23, 1935, Schultz himself was shot by hitmen in Newark restaurant. The killing was ordered by other white gangsters who had decided that Schultz was too reckless, too dangerous, too likely to attract unwanted attention to their operations. His body was found in the restroom of the Palace Chop House, and he died in a hospital the following day without ever regaining full consciousness. Bumpy Johnson took over Schultz's former Harlem operations and built them into an empire that would last for decades. He became a legendary figure in Harlem, respected not just for his business acumen and his capacity for violence, but for the principle he had established during that week in September 1935. He had demonstrated that black gangsters would not accept public disrespect from white criminals, that racist contempt would be answered with blood, that the hierarchies governing legitimate society did not apply in the underworld. The lesson Johnson taught lasted not just years but generations. White gangsters who dealt with black operators after 1935 were careful about their language, careful about displays of contempt, careful about any assumption that racial superiority gave them license to treat colored criminals as inferiors. They remembered what happened to Dutch Schultz when he forgot that respect flows in both directions. They remembered the 9 bodies discovered over 7 days, each with a note counting down to the final reckoning. Criminal interactions in New York changed permanently after that September week. Black and white gangsters continued to compete and cooperate and occasionally kill each other over the decades that followed. But the open racial contempt that Schultz had displayed at the Cotton Club became rare, and those who expressed it learned quickly that consequences would follow. Bumpy Johnson had established a principle that outlasted his own life, a rule written in the blood of 9 men who died because their boss forgot that every person, even a criminal, deserves to be treated with basic dignity. 9 bodies in 7 days. A message written in blood that New York's underworld never forgot, and a lesson that echoes through history. Choices have consequences, and the consequence of public disrespect was death for those who forgot that fundamental truth.